Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. So I just wanted to make a little video today about the endless spells and just their journey throughout the editions. I just decided to do this, as you've probably heard or probably seen. Endless spells have gone through quite a few changes in the recent edition, especially with the new General's Handbook that recently came out at the time of making this video. So I just wanted to make a little video detailing its history and how we got to this point, especially when many are considering this maybe the golden age for endless spells. But I just want to give a little more context to that. So let's begin. So, endless spells. What are they exactly? Well, that's a pretty good question. Endless spells, for the most part, are for one thing, they never start on the board at the beginning. They have to be brought onto the board by casting their spell, just like any other. What separates them from other spells is that instead of just simply adding an ability to an existing art unit on the board or doing damage to an enemy unit, it essentially summons on an endless spell model to the table. And basically what this spell does is it remains on the table until it is dispelled in a subsequent round by either a friendly wizard or an enemy wizard. But until then, at the beginning of every hero phase, the endless spell's ability will kick in. Now, there are two types of endless spells. Basically, there are immobile endless spells. These endless spells are placed onto the table after being successfully cast or summoned, however you want to describe it, and their abilities affect models around them depending on what they are. For example, you have the Palisade, which once placed on the table, it impacts a unit's ability to shoot. But again, it is immobile. Once it's placed there, it cannot be moved unless it's dispelled and then recast in a later turn. The other type of endless spells are called predatory endless spells. They come onto the table and they move during every hero phase. That includes yours and your opponent's. Basically how it works is they are tied to a character, the one who summoned them, or sorry, cast them onto the table. And as long as that wizard that brought them onto the table is alive, only you can move it. However, if it goes beyond range of the caster, generally about 30 inches, then it becomes wild, at which point it could go after basically anybody. Essentially, you or your opponent, depending on certain conditions, can control it, which can cause the spell to come back and bite you, so you have to be careful. So, another thing to also keep in mind with endless spells is they cost points. So, for example, generally in the range of like 30 to 100. So that needs to be kept in mind when you're looking to bring them. So, generally speaking, they've been in the game for relatively a while now. However, they went through quite a bumpy ride rules-wise between editions. So, basic endless spells essentially were first introduced at the beginning of the second edition. They were kind of billed as the big thing to kick off the new edition of Age of Sigmar. You know, they were billed alongside the Soul Wars book. So, at first when people were hearing about them, there was a lot of interest. Like the whole idea of spells staying on the table and actually being physical models, it was a pretty cool concept in theory. However, as soon as they started to be introduced, a lot of issues started to come up. Like I said, the whole idea of endless spells is really interesting because the whole idea of you're casting spells and bringing whole models onto the table to represent that spells has a lot of potential. They couldn't be charged, they couldn't be attacked because they weren't technically model units. They were endless spells. So you could use them to block movement because you can't land on them or anything. They can, unless you dispel them, they could always stay on the board. So if your opponent didn't have any wizards, they pretty much just had to deal with them. So this had some really good things in theory. However, the problem was their movement mechanic was not all that well thought out, in my honest opinion. So basically, how it worked was, for every endless spell on the table, the person who had the second turn, so you both did a roll off, and whoever goes second, he would move one endless spell on the table first, and then the person who goes who now has the priority, he would then move one, and then your opponent, she would then move another, and you would keep doing that until all the endless spells would moving. So it would so this can already you could see some issues. But the problem was it was also every endless spell on the table. So yours and your opponent. So you could actually had incidents where your opponent was actually the one moving your endless spells for you. And that led to some really big problems, especially in regards to randomness. So, you could summon, Ravanax Gnashing Jaws onto the table, your opponent gets second turn, and then he could just take your endless spell and just ram it right into your own lines. So that led to some real big issues with, like, reliability. Now, there were some endless spells, for example, like the cogs, who don't move. Like, you summon them on the table, they stay put. Those had definitely had a lot more usability. But problem was, especially when they were being introduced, a lot of especially the immobile endless spells, a lot of them either had two problems. They either were very expensive, like I said, they could be anywhere between, like, endless spells were generally between 30 to 100 points, and their abilities weren't great, especially not for their points. Like you said, there were some exceptions like the cog, but for the most part, especially the stationary ones, they were questionable at best. And also a big issue with this was later in the edition, we started getting a new type of endless spell called incantations, which were basically endless spells, but they weren't actually spells. They were brought on the table through prayers. So, for example, the Blades of Corn, sorry. The Blades of Corn, they had all these incantations that were brought on by their priests, and because they were incantations and not spells, during the second edition, especially at the beginning, they couldn't actually be removed. So how it worked was they generally had, like, caveats in their rules that, okay, at the end of the turn you have to roll a 5+ to keep it on the table, or it disappears, blah blah blah. But the problem was, if your opponent got lucky and always made those caveats, they would never leave the board, and there was nothing you could do about them. And also, they often had, like, stipulations on who could actually move them. They were much more reliable. So, basically, on the one hand, you had these really random and unreliable endless spells that, either were too expensive for what they did, or they were just too unreliable. And then you had this influx of incantations with, like, the Fire Slayers and the Blades of Corn, bringing on these incantations that you couldn't get rid of, technically, and were much more reliable for what they did. Making it so that by the end of the edition, you almost never saw endless spells, because they more often than not, they could be a liability, because, why would anyone summon a spell that could literally just be that your opponent could literally just take and ram it right into your lines? Like, I just don't, like, many people just, and all that for 100 points. Like, why would you do that? So, coming into 3rd edition, endless spells got a bit, I would probably call a major overhaul. Actually, no, I'm probably underselling it a bit. They had a very major overhaul. Okay, now this edition, I kind of feel that second edition, in my opinion, was probably, in my opinion, the prototype phase. Like, they had this really cool idea of endless spells, but they just didn't really properly think out how they were going to balance them or integrate them rule-wise into the game overall. Now, 3rd edition, especially in the first General's Handbook and the new core rulebook, really redefined how endless spells work. So, the biggest thing probably for me is how movement was changed. Now, instead of having random movement with this person going second in a battle round, moving the first endless spell, and then you moving the endless spell, essentially now what happens is when an endless spell is cast and summoned onto the table, the wizard who casts that endless spell now had complete control of it, and they could move it during every hero phase. So during your hero phase, you could move the endless spell, and then your opponent's hero phase, as long as your wizard was still alive and your endless spell was in range of it, generally, like I said, 30 inches, you could move it during their hero phase as well. So this was a major improvement, as it helped one of the biggest issues within the spells, namely their randomness. You know, like you had to, like, now you never have to worry about, you know, your opponent just in the first turn taking your spell and just wiping your general out with it. Now you had a lot more control. And this really helped with endless spells getting back into, I would say, the scheme of things. Like I say, and also on top of that, there was also a dropping in points with endless spells over the board, so that was really good as well. However, issues still existed. However, one of the biggest ones was nerfing. So during the first General's Handbook, a lot of spells, especially the predatory endless spells that could move in every hero phase, got significant changes to their War Scroll abilities. Now they were significantly weaker in terms of how much damage they did or what abilities they conferred. It just wasn't as good as it was in the previous edition. My personal theory, especially in regards to predatory endless spells, is now that they could move, now that you had much more control over them and you could move them in every hero phase, I think what happened was they tried to tone down their abilities to keep them from being overpowered in regards to their new movement. And the stationary ones didn't receive as much change, but they got a bit of some of them got a bit of a point hike as well. Again, probably due to the change ups and how the core rules worked. So again, movement in the right direction, but there were still some issues in that they were more reliable in the beginning of 3rd edition, but their abilities were technically weaker than they were during 2nd edition. So, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of situation. Now, bringing in over to to 3rd edition General's Handbook 2. Now I feel we're finally starting to hit the gold in the coal mine here. So now with, for example, now General's Handbook 2 hit partially through 3rd edition, and one of the biggest things it did was change up to how the abilities for endless spells work. There was no actual change to the core rulebook abilities, for example, like how endless spells are dispelled, how endless spells are cast, you know, like how they move. None of that has changed. However, the big change that came about was, for example, well, 2 things really. One was points, and the second was rules. Now, basically, all the current endless spells, without going up too much in price, now had much better abilities. In fact, many pointed out their abilities actually pretty much went back to what they were. Pretty much went back to what they were in previous 2nd edition. In that so basically you had the really good abilities of the 2nd edition, but with all the advantages to movement and control that you had in the 3rd edition. And with this, many people have now finally starting to see some real uses within the spells, because now you have much more control and much more control with them, which makes them more reliable. But you also have much better abilities with them too. Like, not just the predatory endless spells, but the stationary endless spells as well, all saw, in my opinion, major improvements almost across the board. And even some that received nerfs, I found that these were actually very good nerfs, because it made some cheeky abilities a little more balanced in a certain ways. So some major shout-outs include like the Palisades, which before it was basically just a blocking mechanic. Now it has like an ability to actually just shut down shooting within a range that increases every turn, which has some major applications for things like, you know, not Overwatch, Unleash Hell, and just shooting in general. As always, the chronomatic cogs, they had some major overhaul to how slowing and speeding up time works. Really good stuff right there. I'm not gonna go over them too much, because you can basically find them easy enough online or through the app. But and then of course the one that everyone's been talking about lately is the Purple Sun. The Purple Sun, for such a cheap price, as some people have started to point out, it's basically Nagash in a bottle. Like, with the way its abilities works and how it affects armor saves and just the leading stuff. Like, Purple Sun it is now becoming the Purple Sun meta right now. There's no line about that. So I'm really glad about that. So, overall, what is my thoughts on all this? Well, in my opinion, I think that after a very shaky start come the second edition, and maybe a step backward, well, not a step backwards, but a two-step forward, one step back issues with the first General's Handbook, which second edition, with third edition General's Handbook 2, I think we finally hit the perfect spot for Endless Spells. They've got good abilities, they're relatively cheap, and they've got the reliability. Like, I'm seeing Endless Spells come out a lot. Like, they're like much more than they ever were before. Like, they're good for blocking. They got great abilities, and like I said, with some very good ones, like, you know, for example, the Starscream Bridge and the Purple Sun. They have some really good ways to help out your army. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but right now I think after 2.5 editions, GW finally found a way to make Endless Spells both balanced but also practical. So yeah, that's pretty much all my thoughts. Thanks for stopping by, and happy wargaming. Yeah, cheers.